right. Well, hello, everyone. I am Billy Dees. Welcome to the podcast. I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you have never checked out the program before, we are primarily an interview and a commentary podcast. You can find the Billy Dees Podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts are found. And you can find me on Twitter at Billy Dees. What we are going to talk about today is live events, let's say, unfolding on TV. How important is this? How important is this that we need to keep doing it, especially when it sensationalizes pain and suffering? And most recently, the tragic events leading up to this commentary actually was the Heche situation. So I'm going to cover that a little bit. And I'm also going to talk about what happens in sports when an athlete gets injured. I'm going to cover all of those things here today on the podcast. I'm also going to touch on the reaction on social media in regard to Heche and some of the stigmas that have been put forth. As always, sometimes social media can be such a great thing. I do a lot on social media. I've been very enthusiastic about social audio and some of these other things that have been going on. But it's just like anything else. It is a tool. And so many times there have been things that are just some of the most horrible things have been said regarding this incident with Heche. And I'm going to try and break this down. So before I get into what happened on television, I want to kind of set the record straight on a few things. First of all, if you are new to the podcast here, I am not one to make excuses for celebrities, professional athletes, famous people, politicians, on down the line. Okay. As a matter of fact, I'm just the opposite. I believe that when you are in a position where you have been handed the sun, the moon, and the stars, okay, you have a certain obligation to treat the general public and behave in a certain way that shows that you appreciate the success that you've had and which has largely come from the public. Okay, so I am not one to make excuses for celebrities at all. I'm actually from northeastern Ohio, and this is a place that worships football stars. Okay, football stars where I am from. Okay, you got to keep in mind the Professional Football Hall of Fame is right down the road for me. It's a gigantic complex. Okay, it has grown the last couple of years just immeasurably. Okay, we are less than an hour away from the Cleveland Browns. A little longer than that to get to Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Steelers. And, Ohio is the home of the Ohio State. This area has probably put forth some of the most famous football players of any other region in the country. Okay. And like I said, they're next to divinity here. And I do not excuse bad behavior. As a matter of fact, I am very critical of questionable behavior, let alone bad behavior. Okay. When you are idolized by the public, especially children, okay, you have a certain obligation to give back to that community by behaving publicly with a certain amount of decorum, with a certain amount of respect for the people around you and the image you are emulating. So this isn't going to be one of those things where I'm going to excuse some of the things that celebrities have done. The second point that I'm going to make here today, before I state that, let me say up front that I am not an expert when it comes to addiction recovery, mental illness, and all of these other things. So a lot of what you're going to hear, pretty much all of what you're going to hear is my opinion. However, I have worked very closely with nonprofits, both as an employee and as a volunteer specifically, I'm going to say over the last 5 to 10 years. So I have a lot of experience working with the public, working with outreach programs. And as some of you may know, being from Ohio, the addiction problem here in Ohio has been extremely bad. And with all that being said, being that involved with it, I believe I can make some observations that I believe have some validity. A lot of the criticism that has been leveled toward Anne Heche has been in regard to her behavior leading up to the serious accident. And, this includes driving erratically, driving at a high rate of speed, possibly have been under the influence of something. And they point out, and quite correctly, that she could have hurt or killed someone in the process of behaving like this. And there's no part, I've been around the recovery community for, like I said, a very long time. No one has ever suggested to me that accountability is not part of your recovery. Now, here in Ohio, for example, there's been a different attitude when someone comes forth in the legal system and it's their first offense, let's say. They've put no one at danger other than themselves. They haven't trafficked or anything like that. The attitude is, let's help this person. Let's give this person an opportunity, a path to recovery, as opposed to putting them directly in the legal system. And most of the time, if they don't comply with the recovery outlines that have been put forth, they get referred to some sort of an agency or something, then they do go into, the prison system. But providing they haven't hurt anyone, it's a first offense, and they've, haven't trafficked or anything like that, there is a general feeling of, let's get this person help. Let's at least try to turn this person around. And there's accountability that's involved with that. And that depends on the judge and what other things they're going to impose. In the case of Anne Heche, obviously the destruction of property and other things were involved. And here again, no one is suggesting that had she survived the incident, that this should have been without consequence. Of course it should have been. We are so lucky that no one was seriously injured or killed as this thing unfolded. Unfortunately, Anne Heche has lost her life. I don't know a lot of the details about her history. I know that she has struggled with trauma, mental health, and all of these other things. And this is where the stigma component comes into this. Here again, here in Ohio, it's unfortunate/fortunate that the stigma about addiction is starting to fall off. But it's only because the addiction problems here in Ohio have been so bad that almost everyone knows somebody who has been through some of the hardest times of their life, either themselves being directly involved with addiction or having a family member who is. I know there is a tendency by many to say, well, that person made a choice to take drugs and now they're paying the consequences. And on the surface, I understand where that comes from, but it's much more complicated than that. Here in Ohio, for example, we have what are called co-occurring conditions. And this is where mental health has very much been tied in to someone's addiction issues. There is also the issue where people have gotten conditioned to pain pills, largely because of the overprescribing, which took place here in Ohio. Ohio has been described as one of the original pill mills. And with heroin and other things, I've worked with a very fantastic judge here in northeastern Ohio who has started a heroin action group to save people's lives. And he told me that by their research and some of the people that they have come across, that heroin addiction in particular is associated with up to 80%. 80% of the people being afflicted and going into this group have had some sort of child abuse. And of course, that means all kinds of abuse. We don't need to go into all the details, but let's just say it's horrible. So, we have this image of a quote unquote addict, which is not the world's greatest term, but we'll go with that. Driving down the road with long hair, shooting out the window. And he's, that's what an addict looks like. But that isn't what an addict is. When you go outside today and you check out your neighborhood, the person mowing the lawn across the street, that's what addiction can look like. It's much more subtle than that. And it always starts in little steps. This idea that you woke up one morning and said, okay, I'm going to party myself into addiction. Now, in a country of 330 million people, I'm sure that irresponsible behavior, the party life, is a major factor in that. Okay. And no one's denying that. But that is not the path to addiction. That is not what has caused the crisis here in Ohio. Okay, typically these things start like with so many other things, like when you first start to gain weight or anything else, it starts in small little increments. You know, you have a bad day and you're just not yourself. And you remember, you know, when I broke my finger last year, I believe I have a few pills left over. I'm going to go ahead and take one because those made me feel better, and then I'll be okay. And you might luck out. It might work that one time. But then a couple weeks later, there's that next step. There's, well, I'll have a drink. I'll do this. I'll do that. And the next thing you know, as the weeks turn into months and the months turn into years, all of a sudden now there's been changes in your brain. There's been patterns that have changed in your brain. Your mind is telling you, I need this. Okay, I need this to survive. Okay, now you're locked into a very vicious cycle. Can people break out of it themselves? Especially if they get professional help? Certainly. Okay, but it generally requires the support and the understanding of everyone around you, and it can be a very difficult road. People who have been on this path, many of them used to say, well, it was a choice. And this is going to sound really mean, but that's what they say right up until the time it's their kid. Then all of a sudden, well, what happened with Johnny was a little different. Okay, he broke his ankle last year. And that's exactly what happens. I always say, you know, it's just like with what I said about you feel a certain way until it happens to you, until it impacts your family. That is so true of anything. And what we really need to do, and as an individual, and this is myself speaking, you can take this for what it's worth. But no matter how off the wall someone's story is, when I hear it for the first time, I'm always compelled to say, I don't know what that journey was like. I wasn't there. I didn't experience it with them. And I always try to show some empathy. That's not to say that the person involved behaved appropriately all the time, or they are without blame in the situation. But there are times when circumstances can spin away from you. And I'm telling you, I have had issues myself. I have been around a lot of good, strong people in my life who have been through things, whether it be a tragic death in their family or some bad accident or whatever. These things, not everybody gets through unscathed. And a lot of times it can turn out to be some form of addiction. And here again, with mental health, a lot of times these things overlap. People get involved with addiction because they tried experimenting with certain things to self-medicate, to treat themselves from depression or other things. And it's just not as complicated as somebody woke up someday and said, you know what, I'm gonna have myself a good time. I'm gonna party myself into oblivion. And if I get addicted, I get addicted. That is not what happens. Okay, that is an oversimplification of what has happened here in Ohio, and I'm sure around the country as well. So when we talk about Ann Heche, what her path from what I am starting to get now with the mental health, the addiction, and some of the patterns, she is a classic tragedy. I don't know what on around her life, but this is where someone like this, I know that it's hard sometimes when you hear stories of people behaving badly. And a lot of addicts and people who have been on this journey have burnt bridges with their family and other people that in their recovery, they can't always rebuild. And here again, that's part of the recovery process. But this is a human being. I might add, this is a human being who has met a tragic end. And this is a human being who has a family, which is the case in these situations. And before we are too critical of her life leading up to this tragic end, we also need to remember her family members whose journey now is going a different direction. Their journey of tragedy, of trauma and recovery is just beginning. And the family members in these situations can become high risk for suicide. They can themselves become more prone to addiction and mental health issues and a lot of other things. And these family members are hearing these remarks. And it just doesn't happen to celebrities. I have known people who were afraid to put the cause of death in their child's obituary because of the stigma, because of the negative things they were going to be afraid of being said behind their back. How horrible is that? So let's remember these things before we throw out these hateful comments about the path of someone who has met a tragic end, like Anne Heche. We hear relatively often about the death of celebrities, and some of them touch us more than others. And for whatever reason, this one with Anne Heche kind of impacted me. And I believe one of the reasons for that was the live coverage of the accident and her being taken out of the accident. That really upset me. And this is where I'm going to talk about media coverage and television coverage of live events. There are times when there's a relevance to a story that is unfolding live. And sometimes they are violent events that have a relevance to our society. For example, with 9/11, the security issues, the warnings, all the other things that were happening during that day. When the country is under attack, that's the time when I can certainly understand live coverage, even when it shows gruesome and horrible events unfolding on the screen. There are other times, let's say in your local community, some mass killer escapes from prison, and there's live coverage of this. There's helicopters and so on and so forth. Here again, I understand the relevance. And with the Anne Heche accident, I'll go as far to say that I can understand the relevance of covering someone who had a high-speed crash into a home, I up to a point. But here's where I'm going to pull back. There was a very tight shot of someone, at the time they did not know it was Anne Heche, being put into the ambulance, and there was cameras on this from the air. And this has since been replayed. People have screen grabbed it on social media and made these comments like, wow, I've never seen anything like this before. This really bugs me. I am not exactly sure what medically was going on with her. I know that she was basically burned on the inside and the outside. She inhaled hot toxic fumes, smoke, and so on. And her body was exposed to extreme heat while they were trying to get her out of the fire. So my guess is her lungs were badly damaged. Her brain was oxygen deprived, and probably what happened, I'm sure if she was conscious in some sort of a state, she was probably in a high degree of pain. She might have been in shock, and she was about to go unconscious. And there was that last push. I need air. Okay. I need to breathe. And probably what happened is they kind of had her wrapped. She probably came out of that in a desperate attempt to take in oxygen. And from what I understand, on the way to the hospital, she went unconscious and never regained her awareness. So this is someone who is in a desperate attempt to hold on to life. One of the most vulnerable situations you can ever be in. Desperate to cling to life. Desperate to take in a breath. And this is how it was described.
Oh my gosh, he's completely alive. He was trying to get away. I don't know. That was really, really strange. And that's what we love about breaking news here in Los Angeles, is right when you think you've seen it all, something else happens. So there you go. You guys saw it live. Kind of hope we had a better shot. I'm sure they're going to sedate that victim. That was crazy.
Yeah, that was really crazy, wasn't it? Oh, I hope we got a better shot of it. You just never know what's going to happen on live TV. Wow. In all fairness, this announcer expressed at different times some concern, saying that, this is bad, this is a tragedy, so on and so forth. But I just find the way that incident of her being loaded into that ambulance was described. I can't imagine being there describing that way. And the idea that this person tried to get away, I mean, this is just, it's so frustrating to me. Why did that have to be zoomed in on? What was the purpose of that? What was the director, whoever was involved, what was the purpose on zooming in on that gurney? I don't understand what, ethically, I can understand if you want to get into the legalese of this and have it on a public street, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's fine. But this is a human being. Ethically, it was clearly a grave, dire situation. What is the point in zooming in on somebody who could have horrific burns, who could be disfigured? What is the purpose in showing that to the world? What is the purpose in having that person's family have their tragedy splashed out in the public domain for everybody to make comments on and for everybody to repost on social media? Wow, I've never had anything like that happen before. Come on. This was so upsetting to me that I got drawn into this whole Anne Heche thing because of that, because of the way it was covered. And I can understand the morons on social media, all right? And I know that's a terrible thing to say, but there's plenty of them out there. But people who are in the broadcasting business, these are people who, are supposed to be professionals. I understand the need for ratings and all these other things, but there comes a point, there's no way I could have done that. I don't care how much money it was going to make me, I could not exploit someone's life tragedy in that way. And I'm going to wrap this up by saying that this is not necessarily something that is exclusive to these live events. It happens in sports a lot. And here again, I'm going to reiterate, I am not one to defend sports figures. Okay. There's been a lot of them, and being from the area of the world that I'm in, I've been aware of a lot of bad stories about these individuals behaving badly. Okay. I don't make excuses for them. However, I don't understand what happens. What is it that's going through a director's head when there's a football game and somebody has a horrific injury? Their knee is bent the wrong way. And the first thing we do, oh, did you see that? Let's take another look at that. All right. So they play it in slow motion. Oh, we got this other angle over here. Let's do reverse angle. Oh, that's where the bone starts to give. You can see it right there. It's amazing to me. A lot of you may be too young to remember the Joe Theismann incident. He was a quarterback, badly broke a leg on live TV. And this thing was analyzed. And this was, I believe this was Monday Night Football, if I remember correctly. And that was, at that time, Monday Night Football was like a ratings leader. I mean, that was, Monday Night Football, even if you weren't the biggest football fan, you tuned in to hear Howard Cosell and all these other things going on. It was an event. And it was heavily criticized for the way that injury was handled. And I always presumed in the wake of that, we would have learned our lesson. Even when the injury is not as horrific as that, even when somebody has an unknown injury, they're laying on the field, and the players and the trainers and the coaches will, stand around them to give them some privacy. And what do these television people do? Well, they shoot, they get this, telephoto lens, this camera with a great big lens on it, and they find an angle between someone's legs, and they zoom right in on the guy's face as he's grimacing in pain, as he's being checked out. What is the purpose of that? You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to take some of these people who do this, some of these directors and things, and make them have a camera on their face when they get their prostate examined. And we'll show that during halftime, since that's such a great thing to show. This is, I don't understand what the need is to zoom in on somebody in their most painful, physically and emotional, painful moments in their life. I don't understand why these need to be zoomed in on and played and made available so that the morons that are out there, and not, there's some great people on social media. Don't take me wrong. You got to be careful what you say these days, because you make these comments and they're interpreted as sweeping statements. There's a lot of morons out there, but there's a lot of great individuals on social media as well. But I don't understand why we make these zoom in, invasive, exploitive moments of someone's pain available for the morons to repost on social media, set to music with ding-dong comments attached to them. I mean, here again, as professionals, we should know better. This is not something that should be done. So anyway, that's my commentary for this episode of the Billy Dees Podcast. Hey, I'll tell you what, if you have a comment that you would like to send my way, you can do so right on Twitter. That's kind of like my social media home, at Billy Dees. Go ahead and throw me a comment and just be nice. That's all I ask. It's okay to disagree. We all know the saying, right? But just be nice about it. That's what we need. We need niceness. We need to be kind. That's probably one of my favorite hashtags. Be kind. All right. I'm Billy Dees. Thank you very much for checking out our podcast today. Don't forget, I don't know where you're listening to this podcast, but you can find the Billy Dees Podcast if this is your first time, anywhere that it is convenient for you. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, and with our good friends over at Good Pods, just to name a few. So do check us out. Got a great interview coming up next week. Be sure to check that out. I am Billy Dees, and have a great day. I'm Billy Dees and host of the self-titled podcast, The Billy Dees Podcast. We are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast featuring authors and creators talking about their craft, advocates for community issues, and myself and an array of co-hosts discussing current events. There's no partisan ranting and raving going on here, just great content. You can find the Billy Dees Podcast on your favorite platform and on Twitter at Billy Dees. Thank you, and I hope you listen in.